If September 1763 was the month of blood, as in Devil's Hole, then October 1763 was the month of ink. It was the month where the British Empire, exhausted by the endless violence on the American frontier, finally attempted to solve the problem with a map and a pen. On October 7, 1763, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. To the modern student of history, this document is often just a vocabulary term in a textbook. But in October 1763, it was an earthquake. It was the first time that the British government attempted to impose a centralized continental strategy on its American colonies. It drew a hard line down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains, creating a massive Indian reserve to the west and confining the American colonists to the east. The intent was really quite rational: save money, stop the wars, and organize the new territories like Quebec, East Florida, West Florida. The result, however, was catastrophic. It alienated the very people who had fought to win that land. It turned George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Patrick Henry into criminals, technically speaking, by outlawing their land speculation. It told the Scots-Irish frontiersmen that the empire cared more about savages than subjects. October 1763 is the month where the imperial crisis officially begins. It is the moment that the interests of London and the interests of Williamsburg and or Boston and or Philadelphia diverged permanently. October 1763 was a month where the king closed the frontier, while in America, the frontier continued to burn with the final desperate flames of Pontiac's War. So let's start with the event of the month, the Royal Decree. First, there was the drafting in early October. Throughout the first week of October, the Earl of Hillsborough, who was the new president of the Board of Trade, and his clerks put the final touches on the document. The news of the summer's massacres, the fall of the forts, the siege of Detroit, the Battle of Bushy Run, had terrified the ministry. So their motivation was pretty clear. The British taxpayer could not afford another war. The national debt was £130 million. The only way to stop the bleeding was to physically separate the two combatants. So here was the theory. If the colonists were kept east and the Indians kept west, then the friction would stop. Trade would be regulated and peace would return. So that, of course, led to the official proclamation on October 7th, 1763. King George III signed the document at the court of St. James. It did 4 revolutionary things. 1, it talked about new governments. It established civil governments for the new conquests like Quebec in Canada and East Florida and West Florida. 2, it created the line. It forbade any settlement west of the Appalachian Divide. 3, it provided for the eviction. It ordered any settlers who were already west of the line to remove themselves immediately. And 4th, it created a monopoly. It banned private land purchases from Indians. Only the crown could buy land. This killed the business model of the Virginia land speculators like the Ohio Company. So here was the reaction, even if it was, of course, delayed by the travel of news. So the news of the proclamation did not reach America until December, but the decisions made in October 1763 sealed the fate of the empire. First, you would have the aristocratic anger. Men like George Washington were furious. They'd been promised land bounties for their service in the war, and now that land was off limits. Washington would later write that the proclamation was a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians, and he quietly ordered his agents to keep surveying land illegally. It also led to popular anger. To the poor settler, this was class warfare. The king was locking up the land to keep them poor and dependent. It fueled a deep anti-monarchical resentment in the backcountry. There was also the ongoing siege of Detroit. While the king was signing papers, Pontiac was facing the collapse of his coalition. First, let's look at the letter from Neyon on October 30th. The turning point of the entire war arrived in late October, not with a battle, but with a letter. Here was the context. For 6 months, Pontiac had told his warriors that the French armies were returning. He had besieged Detroit waiting for this help. But here was the reality. The French commander in the Illinois country, Neyon de Villiers, finally sent a formal letter to Pontiac. The message was blunt. The war is over. The King of France has made peace. We are not coming. You must lay down your hatchets. And here was the impact. This letter shattered Pontiac's authority. The lie that had sustained the rebellion was ultimately exposed. This meant that on October 31st, the siege lifted. On the last day of the month, Pontiac accepted defeat. He sent a note to Major Gladwin. "My father, the Master of Life has put it into my mind to make peace with you. I desire that you will leave off the bad usage of my young men, and I shall do the same." Pontiac did not surrender. He simply lifted the siege and melted away into the Maumee country to try to raise a new rebellion elsewhere. But the Siege of Detroit, the longest sustained Indian siege in North American history, was over. The British had held the fort. Then there was the massacre of the surveyors in the Wyoming Valley. While Detroit cooled down, Pennsylvania flared up. The Paxton Rage that had been building all summer finally exploded in the Wyoming Valley, which is in northeast Pennsylvania. A group of settlers from Connecticut had moved into the Wyoming Valley near modern Wilkes-Barre, claiming the land despite conflicting claims from Pennsylvania and the Iroquois. They were isolated and confident, and that confidence ultimately led to an attack on October 15th. A war party of Delaware warriors seeking revenge for the destruction of their own villages by Colonel Bouquet's forces struck the settlement. So here was the violence. It was brutal. 10 settlers were killed and scalped. The rest fled into the mountains. There was also the Tidiuscung factor. This attack was complex. It was partly revenge for the death of the Delaware leader, Tidiuscung, who had died in suspicious fire earlier in the year, which the Delaware blamed on the settlers. So what was the significance? Well, the Wyoming massacre terrified Philadelphia. It proved that despite Bouquet's victory at Bushy Run, the eastern settlements were not safe. It poured gasoline on the fire of the Paxton Boys, who began to argue that the Quaker government in Philadelphia was letting them be slaughtered. And then there was the economic texture as the Depression deepened. In the port cities, there was an urban gloom. October was a month of financial reckoning. There was the credit crunch. With the year ending, British merchant houses began closing their books and demanding payment from American partners, but the Americans had no cash. The Frontier War had killed the fur trade. The harvest was disrupted. And then there were the bankruptcies. In October 1763, there was a spike in insolvencies. Prominent merchants in New York and Boston began to fail. So what was the political connection? Well, this economic pain made the colonists hypersensitive to money. When rumors began to circulate that the new Prime Minister, Grenville, was planning to enforce customs duties more strictly, the reaction was sharper than it would have been in good times. The economic depression was the tinder, and the taxes would be the spark. So let's look at the texture of life at the time. The American identity in October of 1763 offers a glimpse into a changing psychology. There was the old view. Before 1763, a Virginian considered himself a Virginian not an American. He had more in common with a Londoner than a Bostonian. But then there was the new view. The Proclamation of 1763 began to create a shared grievance. For the first time, Virginia speculators, Pennsylvania frontiersmen, and New England migrants faced a common barrier imposed by a common, distant power. The line created a sense of us, those who wanted the land, versus them, those who forbade it. There was also the religious lens. The clergy continued to preach that the Indian War was a divine test. Colonies proclaimed days of fasting and prayer in October. The message was that the empire's victory over France had made the people proud and sinful, so God sent the savages to humble them. This religious narrative helped unify the colonies in a shared spiritual crisis, albeit a deeply racist and troubling one. As October 31st, 1763 brought the first frosts to the pumpkin fields of New England, the first British Empire was technically at peace. Pontiac had lifted the siege of Detroit. The Treaty of Paris was ratified. The king had issued his proclamation to settle the borders. But it was a hollow peace. First, there was the proclamation on October 7th, which had legally alienated the colonial elite and the frontier poor. And the siege of Detroit ended, but Pontiac remained at large. He was always a symbol of resistance. And then you had the Paxton Boys, who were sharpening their knives in Pennsylvania, preparing to turn their rage against their own government only a few months away in December.